Hi, I'm Nicole-Marie from the Data Literacy Lab, and in this video, I will explain how I created a data visualization about the prevalence and inconsistency in definitions of hookups on college campuses nationwide. The steps I will describe include three components of our data literacy model: accessing data using Google Scholar, analyzing and organizing data using Google Docs, and communicating data using Adobe InDesign, Flourish, and MapCharts. First, accessing data. My data came from 4 research studies I found on Google Scholar, a freely accessible database with scholarly literature. Because I wanted to find sources that contain the words hookup culture next to each other, I put quotation marks around the term hookup culture and searched for it. I came up with approximately 1,990 results. I started going through the results, downloading each report, and saving each to my Google Drive so I could mark up each one. After I felt I exhausted all search possibilities, I moved on to my next search term, casual sex. Next, analyzing and organizing data using Google Docs. Remember, because we're focusing on the prevalence and commonality of hookups on college campuses nationwide, I was looking for original research with the percentages of students who said they hooked up. I skimmed the report and paid special attention to these numbers. As I read the numbers and looked through the studies, however, I found something else. In almost all of the studies, there was a different definition for hookup. One defined it as when two people get together for a physical encounter and don't necessarily expect anything further. Another broke down the definition into 3 definitions: one-time encounters, longer casual relationships, and any non-romantic experiences. Another didn't define it at all. The studies I found were asking students how often they hooked up based on a definition, which affected the way they responded to it. I decided that I needed to highlight that in my data visualization. For each study, I created a table on Google Docs with 2 columns: the definitions of hooking up and the study details. I copy and pasted relevant information from the studies into the tables. I ended with a detailed 13-page document with charts that contained all of my findings. Because I wanted to include my research only on one graphic to make it more readable, I decided to narrow down my long list of studies to only 4. Last but not least, I communicated my findings. In my data visualization, I decided to highlight 3 of my most important findings: where exactly the studies took place in the US, the inconsistent definitions the studies provided, and how often students reported they hooked up. Before jumping into designing my data, I decided to take a step back and think about how I wanted to present it. Because our data on the prevalence of hookups is numerical, I started by presenting the data in a graph. I plugged in my data into Microsoft Excel and generated a bar graph. This gave me a visual of what my data should look like. Next, I had to incorporate the definitions and geographical locations of the studies, so I hand drew out a dummy version of what I'd like for this to look like. My drawings presented each study in its own separate module. Next, I decided the best way to combine these visualizations was on Adobe's InDesign application. To represent the locations of the studies, I use mapchart.net. To represent and generate each graph, I use flourish.studio. I laid out what I drew in my sketch and wrote a headline encapsulating the topic: hooking up and the prevalence of hooking up. I also wrote an explainer emphasizing the inconsistent definitions of hookups found in my research, as well as how findings vary based on study locations. Finally, I inserted citations at the bottom of each design module to credit each study. I also added links to mapchart.net and Flourish to make sure I gave credit to the other applications I used for the visualization. Finally, I exported my design as a JPEG and a PDF. For more information and to see the final product, visit datalitlab.xyz.